Welcome to the Power of ERDC podcast. I'm your host, Tim Reeves. Assessing widespread damage, whether on a battlefield or in the aftermath of a natural disaster, has long been a slow, manual process that delays critical response efforts. To solve this, a team from ERDC developed the Battlefield Damage Assessment Tool, an easy-to-use, web-based system designed for rapid analysis. This technology proved valuable in the response to the 2023 Maui and 2025 Los Angeles wildfires by providing crucial data for debris removal. It was also instrumental following Hurricane Helene in 2024, giving emergency responders the information needed to allocate resources more effectively. Joining us today are two key researchers behind this project, Nikki Wayant and Charlotte Ellison from ERDC's Geospatial Research Laboratory. Thank you each for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Great. So let's just start from the very basic part of it. What is the Battlefield Damage Assessment Tool, and what problem was it originally designed to address for the military?
I'll take that one. BDA, or the Battle Damage Assessment, also called BDA, it's technically a very manual process. It entails an analyst reviewing an individual building and making a judgment as to how much it's been damaged. So they're literally looking at it and going, that looks like 50% damage. This can be very time consuming as the assessment is only completed one building at a time, and it requires trained personnel. Our BDA tool reduces a lot of that redundancy and time and the manual aspect of it. Our tool has two components. The first is the 2D component, which takes a post-damage image and determines which buildings have been damaged. This information is then given to the 3D portion of the tool, where using both before and after damage paired imagery can determine the percentage of the building that has been damaged. This process is quick and can be completed over a large area instead of one building at a time. We've noticed that this is very important when you're talking about larger battlefields that are experiencing large amounts of damage. It takes a long time to do BDA if you have to go building by building by building. And it's much faster if we can just give it to a computer.
So, Charlotte, a key part of this story is how this tool developed, like Nikki just laid out, developed for military purposes, was adapted to help with disasters here at home. Can you talk about how this transition happened and why it's so important for response efforts, like we mentioned, the wildfires and the Hurricane Helene?
Yeah, so as Nikki was saying, he had developed this originally for the battle damage assessment task, and we had presented it and kind of shared it more broadly with the defense geospatial community. And someone kind of in that audience put us in contact with folks having a similar task in the kind of geospatial disaster response community. So then with some conversations, we realized kind of what was similar, what was different, how could we adapt our tool kind of from a technical perspective, what were the inputs they were and what exact tasks they were interested in. So a lot of it was similar in terms of being able to quickly identify what buildings have been damaged, but there are also some differences. So for example, they're also interested in being able to quantify debris. And both those tasks are super important because it's, a huge logistical operation. So any information that they can get, faster, more accurate, that then can be handed off to the experts to either, go on the ground more quickly or be able to clear debris to then move on to whatever next stage of disaster recovery has to happen.
So Charlotte, let me just ask you a question. As far as the the satellite imagery rather, and Nikki, you can answer this as well too. Debris is debris, right? I guess it's just a matter of, applying this technology that was for the battlefield and, bomb damage and effectiveness of such weaponry. And then also as far as a natural disaster, having grown up on the Gulf Coast and such, being post hurricanes, I guess debris is debris in the world of this imagery, correct?
Yeah, that is true to a certain extent, but there's also can be differences. So for example, the environment around that the buildings are in. So for example, a model trained on kind of a desert area is going to be great then at identifying damage in a new image over desert. But if it's then you're giving an image of rainforest or some other, rural versus urban kind of building infrastructure, there might be some kind of fine-tuning and generalization that we need to start to think about.
So, Nikki, back to you. What does this tool do for an emergency manager on the ground, like the Maui wildfires? And how is that different than, say, the battlefield damage analyst that you mentioned earlier in a combat scenario?
Yeah, so for battle damage assessment, they're really looking to see which buildings have been damaged, and they want to know how much damage each building has taken. From an emergency management point of view, it's kind of similar. We want to know which buildings have been damaged and also how much. But like Charlotte was talking about, a big portion of this is the quantification of debris. I hadn't realized what a big deal debris was in terms of natural disaster recovery. But being able to use our 3D portion of the tool to quantify the amount of debris that we have is very important for the recovery effort. And that's the big key difference between our military and civil use of the technology.
And Nikki, one more question though. As y'all have been able to deploy this for the, on the response to emergency or natural disasters and stuff, they're taking this data and doing what with it? I guess they're deploying resources more effectively, I guess, or how have you seen it on the ground or in response to using this tool?
Yes, a big part of it has been knowing what type of resources they need to take the debris away.
Gotcha.
So they're not making a guess about how many trucks they need to, or how many trucks they need to take the debris away, or barges. They can have a more accurate estimation of what resources they need.
Gotcha. Well, so Charlotte, as for the technology itself behind the BDA tool, what are some of the key sources for data? We talked about satellite imagery, and how does this system use that wealth of information kind of to tell you where and how much damage has occurred?
Yeah, so I think as Nikki mentioned, there's two approaches that we use kind of in tandem. I'll start with the 2D approach first, and that was the more data intensive one. So we use computer vision techniques, neural networks. So what they require is a lot of training data. So in our case, that would be the satellite imagery that has damage in it, but also labeled for us to be able to pass it through the neural network for it to learn what does damage look like. And then in the present time or in the future, when an analyst is trying to identify damage in a new image, it passes that image through the neural network and they get a prediction. So that is a lot of what we talked about in terms of if it's trained on a certain area, it's going to do well. How do we then adapt it to a new area? That was something that we had to kind of deal with. But on the 3D approach, on the other hand, that doesn't require any training data. Instead, you need 2 or more images from before the event has occurred, and then we can apply photogrammetry techniques to be able to reconstruct a 3D kind of scene of what is in the image. So just how you have 2 eyes and you can get depth perception, it's kind of the same concept to go from the 2D satellite images to 3D reconstruction, volumetric reconstruction there. So we do that before the damage has occurred, and then after we can measure the change in volume, and then we can measure damage kind of by equating how much the building has changed to damage. So that is nice because it doesn't require that training data. It can be used in a whole new area kind of more effectively, but you do need more images kind of at the time of use. You need at least 2 before and 2 after damaged images. So that's how they kind of complement each other and work well, maybe in different scenarios, or also the 2D approach is kind of like needle in a haystack type of approach, while the 3D is much more targeted. You can get a more exact measure of the change in volume.
So, Charlotte, one more question, but what are some, I guess another question would be is like, we're talking about satellite imagery, but what are some other sources of information? I think we, in an earlier conversation, I think we talked about like, after a disaster, you've got drone footage or other things that help better label this disaster or better understand the elements to make it smarter. I don't want to get ahead to another question, but I guess the more information you have after the fact makes these determinations smarter, faster, better. All great adjectives, all the same thing. So
yeah, exactly. So things like resolution, the higher the image resolution. So for drones, you can get something higher resolution like satellite imagery. More if the imagery comes in sooner, then you can start processing it and feed it to the decision makers faster. For 3D, if you have LiDAR, then that is, better than doing the 3D reconstruction, but that's rarely, or I guess depending on the situation, that might not be available. It's not something you can count on. So we needed something that didn't rely on that.
Charlotte, next question to you as well. You mentioned training this tool and dealing with a, quote, small data problem to teaching it and working in completely new environments. You mentioned the differences between city landscape or desert, or, I would imagine Arctic is different than rainforest and such. Walk us through some of those challenges and how kind of you and your team or you and others solve that.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of laid out the challenges of a model trained on one area might not do well when it's used over a different area that looks different for whatever reason. So, like, one simple approach is just to get more data, and we did do some of that. We did, that's just data labeling. But we also kind of took more creative approaches, such as seeing if we could kind of use data from slightly different situations and it would still be helpful. So merging together training on both battle damage as well as natural disaster damage. And that gave us another advantage of kind of better generalization so that we could more quickly adapt to a new scenario because the models will have seen different ones. We also took a kind of the opposite approach, but having regional models. So instead of having one model that's kind of mediocre over everything, have a few different models that are good at doing a specific type or over a specific region. But we still felt like to further future-proof the tool, how can we kind of include the analyst in the training loop? So we use an approach called active learning, which basically does that. You provide the model with a bunch of unlabeled data and it will determine. So in our case, that would just be unlabeled satellite imagery that you're looking for damage inside of. So it'll pick out which areas would be most informative for it to know what the labels are. And then the analyst, labels a few of those areas, and it kind of does a loop and progressively gets better until the analyst is happy with the results. And that also has the added advantage of then the user of the tool has been involved in the training of it and is more, familiar with where it does well, where it might need a little bit more oversight and accountability.
I think our earlier conversation we had, and for people who are listening or watching, don't think we do this as the first time. We've talked before, and so I could, understand terminology. I had to Google a lot of words. But Charlotte, you mentioned, I think you said one time, is the more it's used, the smarter it gets, right? The more data it has, the better it becomes. So as these unfortunate natural disasters occur, which they do happen, that the future iteration of this tool will be better tomorrow than it was yesterday because of that labeling, because of that training, and because of that additional data, I imagine.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If it's kind of kept up to date as new events happen, that is then helpful in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. So, Nikki, this brought together, as a lot of projects we talk about on the podcast, a variety of experts from geographers to computer scientists. Why was the mix of different experts so important to making this tool so effective? And how does ERDC, and you two are with our Geospatial Research Laboratory, how is ERDC nurture that cross collaboration between specialties, between laboratories as well? How does that nurture such effectiveness?
Well, that's a great question. What I think is one of ERDC's greatest strengths is the vast variety of disciplines that we have throughout the organization, and that we really encourage cross-lab collaboration. This project was a strong collaboration between GRL and ITL, and it was important for BDA to be able to have skills from both sets of laboratories. We needed to utilize geographic properties such as remotely sensed data, LiDAR processing, and mapping of damage. We wanted to bring in the computer scientist portion of this work to include our machine learning, our image segmentation, and active learning. And finally, a lot of computer science went into the coding of all these processes into the final web tool that we have today. So the project wouldn't have been a success without all the individuals on the team and all the different experiences and expertise that they brought in.
I would think too that a problem you probably would have solved at one point, they needed you, and you now needed them, and so you probably have chips, or you probably owe somebody at some point on something. I think for this. Charlotte, what's the next big step for this technology? You mentioned, I think earlier we talked about debris, but debris is not all the same. So what's a future capability that you see this tool growing into and being able to help, whether on the military side or the emergency response side?
Yeah, I think the problem that you mentioned of what is the debris, so our tool can identify, where it is, how much of it is, but in order to be able to properly deal with the debris, the responders need to know, like, what is it? So that is kind of a slightly different problem. But I think more generally, goes back to the interdisciplinary team, and something Nikki's great at involving as well outside of ERDC is the end user. So really understanding their needs, whether that's in the military domain or in the disaster response domain, and they really drive the direction we go. And that being an example. From a technical perspective, I think kind of incorporating newer vision technologies. So, for example, vision transformers, that's kind of the vision equivalent of what's behind large language models, and it can be used in a generative sense. So I think going back to the domain shift problem, which is where you train on one area and then you test on another and it doesn't do as well, could we create kind of synthetic data of the new area before something happens there, with enough quality that we could maybe train on that and be able to kind of hit the ground running, or the analyst, wouldn't need to do as much labeling and would kind of have a head start when something happens in a new area. Just as some examples from both kind of user-driven as well as kind of technology advances driven.
Nikki, I'll go a little off script and ask you a similar question. Based on what you have seen this tool used for previously, and we talked about the wildfires and such, and based on some end user feedback, what do you see the next step of? And we know that this particular project ended, I think, September of 25, correct? So what do you see the next iteration of this based on the feedback you received from its use? What do you see next for this tool or for this type of research?
What I'd like to see it do, like Charlotte was talking about, is really expand within the civil works domain, going along with what Charlotte talked about, being able to identify automatically the type of debris that we have on the ground, using some of the convolutional neural networks and the computer vision that we have in the past to identify exactly where the debris files are. And like Charlotte was saying, the type of debris that they are containing would be a huge win. from a military standpoint, I would like to just further evolve the technology by bringing in even more data sets to make a stronger final product. The active learning can take it really far. And if we could expand upon that with adding more data sets behind it, I think we could make something that was really, really powerful.
Yeah. So one of my last questions, I never say this is the last question because oftentimes people say something that sparks another question, but this project recently won, just recently actually, the USA's Innovation of the Year Award, specifically honoring the work of deploying a military tool to solve civil works problems like the response to these wildfires and hurricanes. Nikki, I'll come to you with this one. What does that recognition mean for you and your team? And again, how does it reflect our ERDC's ability to confront, often at the same time, military and civilian engineering challenges?
It was very exciting. We have a text message chain that we all texted each other when we found out about the award, and it was very exciting and unexpected. We loved the idea of being able to use the tool for natural disasters and to help people within our own country. And we hope that it leads to future work on that topic. In terms of ERDC's ability to confront both military and civil engineering challenges, ERDC has a unique environment in that it does both civil and military work. Solving both sets of challenges allows us to utilize military technology in the civilian sector. So I think having labs that do mostly civilian work and labs that mostly do military work and having that collaboration between them, it really allows us to cross-pollinate our research together and allow it to benefit both sectors of work.
So, Charlotte, what was when you on that text thread that now I would love to see, the first few text messages. So, Charlotte, when you found out that y'all had been recognized for this work, what was your feeling as part of the team and as someone who I would imagine toiled over this pretty hard for several years?
Yeah, it kind of brought back all of the long research process that went into it and kind of the meandering path that led us to a product I think we're all very, very proud of and glad that we could expand its impact kind of in both fields. And I think that collaboration made both of them, I think if we had done them separately, they wouldn't be as strong as the fact that we were able to work on both problems at the same time to improve both of them.
So I did. I knew I had one more question. So to either of you, kind of the lessons learned from this, and I know that your hope is that there's a continued effort in this with this tool and this development down the road. But what are some lessons learned as we wrap up? Kind of some lessons learned, and I'll ask each of you this, that you took from this in several years' effort to get to a point that you have been able to apply with ongoing projects or future projects. And we'll start, Nikki, with you.
For me, a big thing that I learned is that you need to involve the end user. You need to make sure that you have the person that's going to be using the tool be part of the process. Because it's really easy for us as researchers to make something cool that we think will solve all the problems. But then you give it to the end user and they're like, yeah, I'm never going to have that type of data.
Right.
Or something along those lines. And being able to have that constant communication with the final user was really huge, especially at the end of the project as we were moving everything into an actual tool and all the research together. And just communication, very strong communication between everybody and being able to talk about what you're struggling with and seeing if somebody else can help you and being able to reach out for that help because we had such a wide variety of expertise. Being able to talk through the problems at the beginning instead of waiting. I think that was really big for us. And we learned a lot of how to depend on one another through the process.
Charlotte, what about you on being able to, some takeaways from this?
I think related to what Nikki was saying, but being open to new ideas and new challenges, like it can sometimes be a bit disappointing if you you've worked on something and then someone's like, oh, well, that's not actually relevant, what you've done. But being able to take that and then go back and make what you've done better, that also goes with like the interdisciplinary nature of the team, being able to take ideas from different fields and being able to apply them. You know, if something new comes along, you read about a new technology, thinking about, okay, how can I use this? How can I incorporate this to move the technology forward?
Perfect. Well, listen, Nikki and Charlotte, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate the previous conversations we had as well that allowed me to ask somewhat intelligent questions on this topic, and I really appreciate your work and your all's efforts to develop it. So, with that, I'll say thank you to each, and to our audience, thank you as well. For more information on this topic and others, you can visit us at poweroferdicpodcast.org. And with that, we'll see you next time. Thanks.